Good afternoon to everyone. Just to hold on while I get all of the various bits of technology working, or at least I hope working. Hopefully you can hear me fine. Just trying to get everything in order. Just a little out of practice after my break, trying to get everything in its proper place. We'll give it another couple minutes as people continue to log in. And then we'll jump into our study. All right, I think I've got all the YouTube part streaming and recording and all that other good stuff. So just a minute and then we'll start. Hope everybody's been doing well over the last few weeks. I had a very relaxing time with the family, just doing little day trips around Florida, which is a beautiful place, just a little warm in the summer.
Oh, well, welcome back, Rabbi, and just give us an hour, we'll stress you out again. I hope not, but
it's not a question of stress. It's more just a question of having more time with the family.
Oh, of course. Glad you enjoyed it.
You know, I get the kids in the car and they're forced to talk to me for an hour or two, or when we drove down to Miami, 4. All right, looks like we have our usual people rolling in. We've given our usual buffer. Like I said, the YouTube side seems to be working. So let's go ahead and get down to business. And business it is. It may seem surprising, but this is a very pragmatic discussion that we have this morning. And with business, you need numbers. If you've ever wondered why the book of Bamidbar is called the book of Numbers in English, it is because the book of Bamidbar has a lot of numbers in it. Most importantly, the various censuses of the different groups, clans, and tribes. And those all have very practical implications. The most obvious that we've discussed before is the idea of having the census in order to muster the army that will be necessary for defending the nation as it moves forward. But today, we're going to look at a different question of numbers and where numbers do or don't matter. And that is for the division of the land of Israel. Remember, we left Egypt not so that we could live in the Sinai Peninsula, but so that we could make it to the land of Israel and resettle the land that had been settled by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, there are a lot more of us now than just 3 people. And you may even remember from the discussion of Abraham's initial settlement that when he got wealthy, the land wasn't big enough for him and Lot. Well, now we're going to see that there are hundreds of thousands of more people than there were at the time of Abraham. How is this going to work? Who gets what? Anybody who has visited the land of Israel will know that even in its more ancient and fertile periods, the land is of uneven quality. There are coastal plains, there are mountain highlands, there's the Jordan Valley, and there are also places where rain rarely falls and springs are harder to find. And we've got a lot of mouths to feed now, and the manna is going to stop. The manna stops when we enter the land of Israel. So the division of the land is of supreme importance. And it's also a place where we can begin to question, that is to say, discuss what counts as a fair division of the land. Just hypothetically for a moment, imagine that some weird computer bug was to sweep through the United States, and it was to wipe all evidence of property ownership, and more importantly, wipe even the memory of who owned what property, so that everybody in every town was just standing around town hall and nobody knew whose house belonged to whom. Nobody had proof of who should have which house. Nobody knew, even if you were in Florida, whether you should be in Florida. Maybe you should be in New York. And what is this concept of New York? You might know your family, but you wouldn't know your place. You wouldn't know your territory. And you could imagine the arguments that would break out as we began to assign this area to this family, this house to this member of that family. People would probably begin to complain. With that in mind, recognize that the people who are coming out of Egypt, grateful as they are for having left Egypt, are now worried about the rest of their life and the life of their children and grandchildren, of what will it be when we enter the land of Israel. And we need to farm and provide for ourselves. Who's going to get what? And will it be fair? Will it be a just distribution of that shared resource of the inheritance of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? So with that in mind, with that level of criticalness to our ancestors' lives, let's go ahead and begin with a bit of numbers and see where it takes us. So we are in Numbers 26, Bamidbar 26, and we're going to start with verse 51. This is the enrollment of the Israelites, the counting, the finishing of the censuses that have just come. 601,730. Again, a reminder that we're talking about men over the age of 20 at this point. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, among these shall the land be apportioned as shares, according to the listed names. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Each is to be assigned its share according to its enrollment. The land, moreover, is to be apportioned by lot, and the allotments shall be made according to the listings of their ancestral tribes. Each portion shall be assigned by lot, whether for larger or smaller groups. All right, is that all perfectly clear? We seem to be getting a number of different pieces of information here. We are being told that the land is going to be divided up into shares, and that the shares are going to be divided according to the Shemot, according to the listed names. We're not 100% sure just from that verse what listed names we're talking about. We're not 100% sure who these are that are being referred to. Our commentaries are going to offer us some options on that. And we are then told in 54, very importantly, that the larger groups are going to get a larger share, and the smaller groups are going to get a smaller share. Does that seem fair to everyone? If you were going to go on a group vacation, let's say that you were traveling to a country and you were going on a package tour, and you all paid the same price to go on the package tour. And when you got there, they said, well, family A has 8 members, family B has 2 members. Therefore, family A will get the largest of the hotel rooms, and family B will get the smallest of the hotel rooms, and everyone in the middle, they'll get the average. Does that seem fair? Is everybody too afraid, or all out of habit of participating?
Well, size.
It seems fair.
So we got one vote for seems fair. And David, you were saying?
Go ahead.
Well, size isn't necessarily the only criteria. Which is more fertile? Which is back in those times, maybe if you're at an elevation, you're safer from enemies. You can see what's coming. You can't be surrounded. There are other factors numerous other factors beyond size.
Right. So to go back to my hotel room analogy, family A with the big family may actually prefer to be in the smaller room because maybe it is closer to the bathroom, or maybe it is closer to the floor so they don't have to haul up their suitcases as far, or maybe it has a better view. Why should the other family get the better view? And on the other hand, somebody else may prefer having more room rather than having a nicer room. So it's not easy to determine what is fair. Certainly, it sounds reasonable to say larger numbers should get more space and smaller numbers should get less. But on the other hand, these are the inheritors of the 12 tribes. And if we were going to divide up the land according to the original children of Jacob, not their descendants, but the first generation kids actually born to him, would we think it appropriate to divide up the land differently based upon their size, based upon how many kids they had while they were still alive, based upon how many kids and grandkids? If you were to be in a family, to change the metaphor from hotels now to family inheritance, which can cause no ends of arguments and strife. If you were in a family and one child of the deceased had a very large family and one child of the deceased had a very small family, would we think, therefore, that the child with the larger number of family members should receive a larger portion of the deceased's estate? Generally speaking, according to Jewish law, we say no, that each member of those that are inheriting should inherit equally, except biblically for the firstborn, who receives a double portion of the division. So regardless of whether the firstborn has, or rather the secondborn has 50 and the thirdborn has 2 members of their family, the second and thirdborn each receive an equal amount from the estate. So now that we're dividing it according to their 4th and 5th generation children, maybe that seems weird that we should be dividing it like that. Why should the tribes that have not created as many great-great-great-grandchildren get less than those that created many more? So that's one aspect of fairness that is very much open for debate. So we have the quality of the land. We have, when are we taking the count? Do we take the count from the original 12? Do we take the account from the 70 who went down to Egypt? Do we take the count from those who left Egypt? Do we take the count from those who are standing here in this chapter? Do we take the count from when the land has actually been taken, which will still be a few years in the future as the armies of Joshua proceed with the conquest? All of those are different factors which could change our perception of how fair or unfair the process is. In the same way, in verse 55, we are introduced to a new measure, which is that the land is going to be apportioned by lot, that there will be a lottery, literally, and that lottery seems to be how the land is going to be distributed. That also seems perhaps unfair. Is it fair to divide the land according to big and small, but then give it differently based upon the random assignment? So we know we're dividing up the land to have some parts accommodate large groups and some parts accommodate small groups, but then we're going to let a random pull from a hat determine who gets which? It seems very difficult to wrap our heads around how this is going to be handled fairly. And as like I said before at the very beginning with our thought experiment, if you could imagine everybody in the US having no memory or record of who owned what, all arguing about who should get what from a blank slate, you can imagine the arguments that would happen during the settling of the land, of who's going to get what. Not the least of which is to then throw in the tribes that wish to take a piece of the land from the eastern bank of the Jordan, sort of throwing a monkey wrench into everything on top of that. So there's a lot going on here, and of course our commentators have tried to unravel it, and we will continue with their assistance and our own insights to try and wrestle with what is fair or unfair in this process. And hopefully you can see that this is not just an ancient discussion of what was fair 3,000 years ago, but trying to figure out who gets a piece of what from a shared piece of pie, whether it be hotel rooms in a package tour, whether it be inheritance from a family, or whether it be any nation dividing up its goods. These are contentious issues that require a great deal of debate and discussion. So let's jump into.
Didn't we try?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
That's
Didn't
okay.
we try this with the Oklahoma land rush where you lined up and everyone would get a certain amount, but you had to be there? Or, I mean, we tried that kind of experiment
Yes,
in our own country, and
Right.
it was a disaster.
Well, in the United States, and also in some other places as well, in the Western Hemisphere, there was a first come, first serve, as long as you ignore the people who were living there when we arrived, but not counting them. There was a first come, first serve policy where people could stake their claim to land in many places without a cost, but they did have to develop the land and settle the land. And it had varying degrees of success. Sometimes it did allow for the expansion of the nation, the development and settlement, and people to grow and our nation to prosper. Sometimes it created opportunities that were rife for corruption and abuse and exploitation. And sometimes it led to wholesale violence. And the arguments over who got which part of the claim that had been staked were legion. So yes, one option is to do first come, first serve, and that doesn't exactly seem to make people happy. So we're definitely going to expect to see differences of opinions about who's getting what. Now, to begin, we're going to look at Sifrei, which is the one of the early midrashim on the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, where they're going to try and parse some of the language from the book of Numbers, including our verses, to figure out who's actually being counted at all when we're talking about the portions that are being divvied up. So, taken first from Numbers 18, and the Lord said to Aaron, "In their land you will not inherit, and you will not have a portion in their midst. I am your portion and your inheritance in the midst of the children of Israel." So, as is familiar, I hope, to most of you, the Kohanim and the Leviim, as we'll see, did not receive a land inheritance. They are not going to be a tribe that receives its own portion. Now, why did this have to be stated? Because it is written in our verse, "To these shall the land be apportioned." So from that verse in 26:53, I would think that all are included, right? It says these meaning the Jewish people. That sounds very, very inclusive. However, I might think that Kohanim, Levites, Israelites, proselytes, women, bondsmen, tumtum, that's to say people that are born biologically with an indeterminate gender, and androgynous, again, people born biologically with exhibiting both gender characteristics, that all of them would be included. However, as is usual from the Sifrei, whenever it says you would think, it means you're wrong because we have counter verses. This excludes Kohanim. That is to say, the verse that we read in 1820 excluded the Kohanim. And in the midst of the children of Israel, they, meaning the Levites, from 23, shall not have an inheritance. That excludes the Levites. Oops. Sorry, just making sure someone was texting, not making a... Good, yeah, not a tech problem. By the names of the tribes of their fathers shall they inherit. This means that bondsmen and proselytes, those who had converted, would not be included in this initial land rush. And a man, according to his number shall his inheritance be given, from verse 54. This excludes the tumtum and androgynous, neither of whom can be said to be specifically a man. Now, there are ways for women to inherit, which we find out later on in the Torah portion with the daughters of Slofachat. But that is a topic I've covered before, and one I'm sure I'll cover again, but not so much today. So we've narrowed down that it's going to be the men that are inheriting, not including the Kohanim, Levites, proselytes, or those of indeterminate sexual identity. Now, that's one layer. Just as an aside, why was it that these were the ones who were getting? Why men? Because that simply was the matter of inheritance law of the day that was already being, pardon the expression, inherited. Land was being passed ancestrally by father to son, and thus it was given to the men to continue that chain. There's a lot more to be said about that in another class. I have discussed it in more detail in other places, but for the moment, the Sifrei is just trying to draw our attention to the fact that the way the verses are written is letting us know that it will be just that small subsection of the overall population that will be included in the division of the land, the apportionment. Everyone following the logic of the Midrash here? Hearing no objections, so moved. All right, so Chizkuni tries to give us a short answer for what to these means. You'll remember that to these was our, where were we? Our beginning phrase, la'ele, on verse 53. So who are the these? These are the heads of these 57 families enumerated in this chapter. The land will be divided up according to ancestral or as ancestral inheritance. So he's saying the most obvious reading of these is that the people who were just mentioned are the these. Each of these 57 family heads would receive a share corresponding to the number of family heads that had been numbered. So Chizkuni is going for what might be the most grammatically simple term only within this context, which is to say, we're going to divide everything up according to the 57 different families that we've already discussed in this chapter. Grammatically, it reads very simply in location. However, it's not 100% sure what that means or whether that's the only way to read the these. Excuse me. And so we're going to look at a broader examination of what the Talmud says in Bava Batra 117. But this one brought by Or HaChaim is a summary because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get through all of the opinions. So to these, the land will be shared out as an inheritance. On the word these, our sages in Bava Batra comment as follows, which means that there are different opinions. Rabbi Yoshia holds that the subject of the word are the people who participated in the Exodus. The word, then, is meant to exclude people who were not yet 20 years of age at the time they left Egypt. So what Rabbi Yoshia is trying to say is that we are going to count kind of retroactively from the people who actually left Egypt. We will take them as the census of the tribes, the people who were there when they left, and anybody born afterwards is considered to be part of the group that was headed by their group at the time that they left Egypt. So this would not give new shares, new percentages to those that had passed the age of 20 after the time of the Exodus. So that's opinion number one. You had to be 20 when we left Egypt, and those people plus those born to those people fall under those original people leaving Egypt's category. Okay. Rabbi Yonatan holds that the land was distributed only to the people who actually set foot in the land under the leadership of Joshua, right? So he holds pretty much the opposite, that it's going to be these, meaning these who take hold of the land. So whoever is 20 or older when they enter the land of the land of Israel, which is coming up under the time of Joshua, if you're 20 when that happens, you get a share. If you were 19 the day before, but then they cross over and take the land on your birthday, boom, you now get a portion. You are part of the count that will be used to allocate the land. So this is sort of the two extremes of where the count will be. Those who left Egypt, and then the children born to them fall under their original person who left Egypt's household, and those who enter Israel, and then people born after them a portion according to them. Now, you'll recognize, hopefully, by these two different extremes, that they're basically the same issue, just picking a different point on a timeline. Because there's an underlying issue here that we haven't discussed, which is this fair to the people who are not going to be there at the time that the land is apportioned? Let me explain that again. If somebody is a single person and they get a single portion of land, and then they have 10 kids who have 10 kids who have 10 kids, those multi-generations will all be inheriting that same original piece of land. Now, his neighbor to that original guy, he may only have one kid and one kid and one kid. That one kid at the end will still get the same amount of land as the, what did I say, 3 generations, the 1,000 kids on the other side would get. So depending upon where you draw the line, it may seem more or less fair. The two original, each getting the same, seems perfectly fair. 1 versus 1,000 does not seem very fair. But at some point, if we're going to divide the line, we have to pick the point where we make the division. Unless we are going to reassign the land continuously, reapportion it constantly, there is a point where the land will need to be divided. And after that, it is up to you and your inheritors to do what you will with the land that you and they have been given. And if it goes out of whack, if one family has a ton of kids and one family has very few kids, it's not going to be reallocated. Now, there are other economic tools to try and make sure that there is enough equity and enough care and consideration for all of the nation. But as far as the ownership of the property goes, this is all believing that it will be one and done, that somebody will get it at a certain point and then it's in that family, and we're not going to reassess by family size after that point passes. We'll come back to revisit that concept when we get to the end of our discussion. Now, this continues with a discussion then of how does Rabbi Yonatan handle the words according to the listing of their ancestral tribes? Well, Rabbi Yonatan feels that in this instance, the Torah applies yardsticks other than the normal ones to the laws of inheritance. What does that mean? Usually, the living inherit the dead. In this instance, the dead inherited the living. So what he is trying to say is that according to the listing of their ancestral tribes, is that those who end up actually taking possession of the land, who put their foot on the land, are creating the inheritance retroactively for those that lived before the land itself was taken. And that's unusual because they are essentially accruing in reverse to the total portion that would be considered part of their ancestors' inheritance based upon the numbers of people that are alive at the moment of possession. And so he is saying, yes, it sounds weird here. It's just an idiom. It's kind of a strange way of wording it based off his opinion, which seems to be talking about the ancestral tribes. But he's saying, special case, it's okay, no problem. Or HaChaim is now going to bring a third option. I have seen a Braita and Sifrei, which offers a third approach. The word these, as in these will be inheriting, is understood to exclude the unworthy members of the Jewish people. That is to say, the wicked. As proof, they cite the sons of the spies and the people who complained against Moses and God. So we would then need to translate the word these as like these. Rather than just ele, it becomes ke'ele. To people such as these, righteous ones who make up the nation as of this day would be the import. Meaning the land will be inherited by these types of people. Meaning the people now are good. When you get there, make sure the land only goes to people like this. Just as only the righteous ones who left Egypt share in the inheritance, seeing they and their children die already, so also at this time only Israelites who were righteous would receive their share of the land. So we have three opinions. One is that the land will be divided according to the number of those who left Egypt. Two, the land will be divided according to the number of those who take possession of the land of Israel. And three, the land will be divided according to the number of those who actually deserve it, the same way that those who left Egypt deserved it. We are eventually going to settle how this was handled, but I wanted to make sure you understood that there were these multiple opinions. Now, in Bava Batra itself, it responds to the idea of only giving the land to those that are righteous with a very important caveat. The protesters in the assembly of Korach did not have a portion of Eretz Israel. Nevertheless, their sons took portions of the land in the merit of their paternal grandfathers and in the merit of their maternal grandfathers, if they were among those who left Egypt. So this opinion in the Talmud says, while it is true, those who were the actual rebels did not get a share, their children did get a share, presuming they were not also rebels at the time. So just because they were descended from somebody who rebelled against God and Moses does not mean that they are punished for their parents' crime. Instead, they are benefiting from their grandparents' merit. Those who were before and did not rebel and behave so badly. So while those that are actively rebellious were not included, those who came from them were included. So it wasn't wiping out whole family lines, it was only excluding individuals.
Wouldn't that apply to the spies? It says the sons of the spies, right? But
right.
The spies were taken 2 from each tribe, weren't they? I mean,
Yes.
that would
Yes.
wipe out everyone.
No.
That
only the spy.
So it
only
makes sense.
Right. Exactly. If you were going to punish everybody who came from anybody who might have rebelled at some point, then yeah, probably nobody would have ended up in the land of Israel except for like Joshua and Caleb. So yes, this was a very important explanation to make sure that we understood that we are not punishing the children just because their parents were jerks. And just because their parents were jerks does not mean that the children and grandchildren would be alienated from their due portion of the land of Israel. You'll also notice that
that's very important.
Yes, and once the land has been apportioned, you'll also notice that a person does not lose their share just because they become wicked. If somebody is in the land of Israel, having already received the share, or they are the grandchild or great-grandchild, and they begin to be idolatrous, for example, they don't lose ownership of the share of the land of Israel that is rightfully theirs. They are punished for their transgression, and all the other legal consequences kick into force, but they do not lose the right to the inheritance that they have. And that's something that's been a very constant and very powerful part of Jewish continuity and Jewish cohesion, is that even when we are disgusted by the behavior of our co-religionists, we don't kick them out. We don't say you're no longer Jewish. You're not doing Judaism very well, and you're certainly not being a credit to our people, but we cannot deprive you of your share of rightly claiming to be part of our nation. You're not a good example of it, and you're not somebody that we should emulate, and depending upon exactly what crime you're committing, you're probably going to be punished, but you don't lose your status. And that's something that, in fact, most countries have adopted. In most places around the world, if you commit a crime and you are convicted, you go to jail, they don't take you to the border and push you out. You don't lose your property that you own simply because you have committed a crime. To do so otherwise, let's just say that nations that have tried to have those practices have ended up rather bad off. All right, so Rashi then wants to try and give us a better idea of this apportionment and who we're exactly including. So, someone else coming in. So even if someone becomes included among those who are 20 before the division of the land, for they were 7 years in conquering it, and 7 years did they take in dividing it, no one received a portion in the land except these. And if one of these had 6 sons, they received only their father's portion. So Rashi, based off the Talmud from Bava Batra, is confirming the idea that we are going to go with the number of people at this point in the Torah. And even if somebody is 20 years old at the time that the land itself is conquered or divided, they are still only going to get a portion of their father's portion, of the person that was 20 at the time when this numbering, this counting, this census took place. So that is his conclusion. And indeed, that is the main point that we are going to work off of, that the total number of people that are going to be given an apportionment as their own apportionment is going to be based off this point in the book of Numbers. And anybody who reaches that maturity threshold afterwards, even if the land has not yet been taken or divided, is only going to receive their fair share of their father's portion from this point. Okay, how does that work out and why is this important? Well, Or HaChaim again is going to give us some examples of what sort of problems might arise. Suppose a father had 10 sons, each above the age of 20 at this time, and another father had 8 sons, 4 of whom were above the age of 20, the other 4 being younger. By the time they all entered the Holy Land, the first father had lost 4 of his sons because they had died, whereas the other father's sons by then had all reached the age of 20. The last mentioned family would have received a larger share than the family which had 10 eligible sons at this time. So if you had gone by the number of people who entered the land, as opposed to the number of people counted at this point, then you could end up with a very much reversal of fortune, where a family that had many would end up with much less than they deserved because of the tragedy of losing their children. And a family that had less would end up with a bumper crop because they had stacked the deck in the meantime and had more children pass that threshold. To prevent such a mistake from being made, any change in the status of the family between now and the actual time of distribution was to be disregarded. So this is the moment when the numbers are set. And as anybody who's ever been a teacher or administrator will know, you always have to have a cutoff time. And the cutoff time will never seem fair to the people who would have benefited if the cutoff time had been later. And the cutoff time will seem very fair to those who would have lost if the cutoff time had been longer. And the cutoff will seem unfair to people who wish the cutoff time had been earlier. You're never going to please everyone. And in fact, you have a high likelihood of displeasing most people. But you have to make a cutoff time at some point, unless you plan to reshuffle the land every year as people continue to hit the age of 20 to accommodate the proportion of land, the proportion each person gets of the land according to the new census. You eventually just need to set the land where it is according to that number. And the Torah seems to be saying that the number that was chosen is the number of people alive over the age of 20 at this point in the book of Bamidbar. Everybody still with me? Okay, because we had the number, but we still haven't had what we do with the lottery. We have this apportionment, but we still don't have a lottery worked out. Well, we're going to see how the Talmud believes that this whole process worked out in the lottery, as well as another very important topic of justice. So this is from Rabbeinu Bachya. The reason the lot, the randomness, had to determine who received what should have put a comma there probably. The reason the lot had to determine who received what was that the land was not uniformly good. So even if you've divided up the land into equal or roughly equal portions, one piece of dirt is not as good as another piece of dirt, something that David brought up in our early discussion. So he who drew a lot allocating to him good quality land did not enjoy a financial advantage, however, as he whose lot allocated to him a less fertile piece of land was compensated financially. So the rabbis believed that although people could, and indeed did, end up with land of greater or lesser quality, there would be a way of balancing that out, of making sure financially that everyone received the same amount. This would be akin to a modern inheritance issue. Imagine a person who leaves behind let's make it easy for math, 10 acres of land with 2 children. You might think that one of them gets 5 acres and the other gets 5 acres. But if one of them has substantially higher quality than the others, one of them is beautiful near a river and very lush and fertile, and the other is pretty terrible, just dividing it in half is probably not going to work. On the other hand, if you can either divide it according to the value of the land or have the one who receives the more valuable piece give up other financial compensation on behalf of the one who's receiving the less valuable land to ensure that the total value being inherited is equal for both parties. That's what's being discussed here. And in order to make sure this is fair, this is the method that's used according to the Talmud. Eliezer, who was the Kohen Gadol, who was the high priest at the time, wore his priestly clothes, including the breastpiece, the Choshen Mishpat, the piece of justice that he wore, with the Urim and Tumim. Those were, if you remember, 2 very special stones that were kept with inside the breastpiece and used for certain types of decisions. And Israel stood around him, meaning the representatives would stand. The pieces of wood with the names of the tribes, as well as the pieces of wood inscribed with the different sections of the land, would be placed in front of him. So he's got all of the groups and all of the territory laid out on what would have been the equivalent of slips of paper. Paper not so easy, wood easy to find. Then he would be inspired with Ruach HaKodesh, with the Holy Spirit, a form of prophecy, and announce the tribe of Zebulun has been assigned section such and such, including the town of Akko. So the lottery at this point doesn't seem to be much of a lottery. It seems to be prophecy, being guided by the Urim and Tumim. When, however, later on, he would withdraw one piece of wood from the box containing the names of the section of the land and one piece of wood containing the names of the tribes, it would be found that what he withdrew matched what he had previously announced. What that means is that the lottery portion was a way to confirm the prophetic portion that he had first engaged in. So first, he opens himself up to the idea of prophecy through the Urim and Tumim, and he makes the pronouncements. And then as a form of corroboration, of confirmation to those pronouncements, they put everything in the boxes. He pulls out one, name and land. And lo and behold, not that surprising, they matched what he had said while being prophetically inspired. So the lottery was a way of confirming what had been said through the prophetic form. We're going to finish off the whole steps, and then we're going to come back and discuss what all of these pieces were trying to tell us. The elders of the tribe would then proceed to divide up their parcel of the land between the heads of the major families of that tribe. Any tribe who comprised a large number of such families at the time of Exodus would receive numerous parcels, whereas the tribe, which at the time comprised only a small number of families, would receive a relatively larger parcel of land. So the land is divided, and then it is up to the allocation of the tribes of which family, sub-clan of the tribe, receives which parcel within the overall territory that was given to that tribe. And this way, it is trying to handle all of the major issues that we were discussing. And again, in a way that's never going to make everyone happy, but in a way which tries to hit all the main points. First of all, the overall division of the land is being done in a way that is both inspired as well as confirmed in a way that everyone could witness. It is inspired, and through the Urim and Tumim, we can have an understanding that indeed this is what God wanted. But through the lottery system, we also have an understanding that it's not only what the Kohen Gadol, Eliezer, wanted, that we don't have to be suspicious that perhaps he wasn't truly being prophetic, And indeed, we know that there is such a thing as false prophecy. Having the confirmation through the lottery system allowed a way to confirm what God had said. Having what God had said through the prophecy system allowed for confirmation and corroboration of what was being done through the lottery, so that we knew it wasn't just random dumb luck, but instead, indeed, was what God actually wanted. But the individual level, the granularity that was needed to make sure each family could be looked after, that was handled by the tribes themselves. Now that they knew what they were dealing with, they then had to work the hard work of figuring out which piece would be best for which family based on what they had. And that was a much more difficult and long process, and one which required the personal interaction to make sure that there would be mutual understanding, agreement, consensus over how the different parcels of land would be allocated. And then once that was done, no one ever wanted to do this again. Because like I said at the beginning, you can imagine that this was such a difficult endeavor, and one that required so much delicate care to make sure that we wouldn't simply dissolve into civil war, that it really required much, much fine tuning. Now, before we get on to just some long-term implications of this, any questions or comments up to this point?
Yes, they don't seem to, this land is not empty. And there's no mention here of, we're dividing the land up, but the land's not empty. So
right.
What are...
So that actually gets covered in the book of Joshua.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there another place where we deal with that?
Yes, that's called the book of Joshua, which goes into much more detail of how the land was conquered and divided, but also how some tribes like Ephraim and Manasseh complained that their piece had way too many enemy cities in it that had not yet been conquered. And that meant that they were not getting their fair share. And Joshua responded, go conquer them. Basically, yes, the book of Joshua deals with a lot of those issues. And then the book of Judges deals with the issue that because of the way the land was allocated at this point, and because of the way people refused to cooperate with each other to settle the land and conquer the land from those violent threats that were still among us, meant that the nation did not properly cohere, didn't properly congeal, it didn't coalesce the way we would have hoped. Much like the Articles of Confederation in American history did not bring the colonies together strong enough, so too this process, because of the lack of fraternal association and cooperation, did not bind the tribes together well enough. There were loose allegiances that they would occasionally help each other when there were problems. But the ideal, which was everyone gets a piece and everyone helps everyone get a piece, that second half did not really seem to come to pass. But that's not a flaw in the process, that's a flaw in our execution. That is the flaw of the nations not being, or not the nations, the tribes not being willing to help each of the other tribes properly. And indeed, that is one reason why eventually the whole tribal system basically begins to dissolve in favor of a unified monarchy. The form that eventually becomes with Saul and then in David and Solomon, where there will be one nation altogether. And yes, people still have a tribal identity, but it is now an under identity beneath the beneath the idea of being an Israelite altogether. And that is ultimately what allows us to sustain ourselves, is having that identity move beyond my clan, my family, my clan, my tribe, to Israelite first and foremost. And this process, this whole idea of the allocation, it may seem weird to us, but that's because we've inherited the eventual outgrowth of all of this wrangling over what is just, which is what is ultimately just is that we are one people. What is ultimately just is that we look out for each other, that we cooperate, that we defend each other, that we support one another. That is the ultimate form of justice that the Israelites eventually work their way towards. But they had to go piece by piece by piece, from family to clan, from clan to tribe, and clan and tribe eventually to one religious nation to reach that point. And that is part of the ongoing process. And that takes us well beyond the end of the Torah. And like I mentioned, on into the book of Samuel, and indeed really into the book of Kings and the prophets to get us to that place. And we are the inheritors of that final lesson, which is why when we finally return after the Babylonian captivity, nobody is complaining about who gets which piece of land based upon their tribal identity. Everyone is simply happy to be back together as a nation again in the land. So, questions or comments as we wrap up for today? It's always important to look at how we got to where we got and to never take what we've got for granted. It's one of the reasons I love these discussions of how they tried to resolve issues in the past that we now no longer worry about, because we don't have to worry about them because they resolved these issues in the past. All right. Well, I look forward to studying with people again. It's nice to be back in the saddle, and we will carry on next week at a regular time. And the other classes are also resuming. That is to say, the Mishnah class tonight and the Pathway to Judaism class tomorrow. Tonight at 7, tomorrow at 6. If you need more information, just email me or contact me in any one of the other ways you can get a hold of me. And we're getting everything rolling again. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.